What happiness is mine, O my God, to be able to pray with my brothers and sisters, knowing on your own word that we have the advantage of your presence in the midst of us. You are with us, O good Jesus, to imbue us with your Holy Spirit, as you yourself have told us by the voice of your prophet. Grant us to receive this Holy Spirit as the apostles and disciples did in the cenacle, when they were assembled for prayer and persevered with mind and heart therein. St. John Baptist de La Salle, with Jesus in our hearts.
What's the source of that prayer? What's that book?
The fundamental prayer. Ever hear of it? That should do for the morning. All right, we left off yesterday, and I was making the point that the foundation of the Institute was a process. And the first stage of the process was the formation of a community, which De La Salle saw little by little was so tremendously important for what he gradually became aware of was going to be his mission. And the problem here is straightening out the dates of the sequence, but I think they're fairly clear now, with most everybody agreeing that he first joined with Niel in opening 2 schools, then he brought them into his own home for meals, then he brought and had a house rented next door for them, then he brought them into his own home to live, then he finally put the house up for sale, and moved in with them to the house on the Rue Neuve. Now, it's in the house at the Rue Neuve, apparently, that that De La Salle's conversion takes place. And maybe one element in that was the loss of the very first brothers, because as this process was going on, some of them began to see, well, this is not what we bargained for at all. He's turning us into some sort of cloistered monks or something, or he's working us too hard at the school, or we don't mind teaching, or we don't mind praying, but it might be very difficult to expect us to do both. So if you go to page 72 of Blain, it'd be interesting to know whether that famous 14-year-old kid was one of those who stayed or one of those who left. Chances are he probably decided to go back to Rouen. But so Blain has these pious reflections on page 72. Notice at the top of that page that Blain's remark that although he let them discuss how they were going to live and how these regulations were going to put together, he says he contented himself with inspiring them with his own spirit and thus gave them the flattering satisfaction of thinking that they themselves had originated their new manner of life and their practices. So anyway, some of them give up and go. And down in the next to the last paragraph, he was obliged to replace nearly all his personnel in the space of 6 months. Only 1 or 2 of the original schoolmasters remained with him. The new institute's tomb seemed destined to be erected close by its cradle. Now, one of the problems is when did this happen? Did it happen while they were still in the founder's own home, which is the view that I think most of us are inclined to now, rather than at the Rue Neuve? Or did it happen when they moved into the Rue Neuve and had all of that, the security of living in the founder's mansion taken away from them? I suppose you could argue either one. But there's nothing very clear here from what Blain is telling us. At least from my point of view, it was a problem in writing the biography. I just couldn't decide where to put it. And I think if I remember, I finally put it while they were still in the founder's own home. Gus, what do you think about that?
I'd be inclined to think of it in terms of the Rue Neuve.
Yeah.
But it's just a hunch.
Yeah. It could be because for that reason, I suspect, that they no longer had the comfort of the founder's own mansion, for one thing, and they could kind of see where it was going. That would be, but there's no real way of making sure by any kind of evidence. Now on page 70, now there's a sequential problem here, because on page 70, this move took place in 1682, and we know from all sorts of evidence that it was in 1682 that Niel was going around, and in conjunction with the founder, to begin to found these schools outside of Reims. In Rethel, first of all, and then in Guise and Laon, and although he doesn't mention it in the heading here, he does a little later on page 77, a school in the little town of Château-Porcien. And as Brother Gus will probably point out to you, the very first of the letters, the oldest of the letters that we have from De La Salle, dates from 1682, and it's addressed to the officials in Château-Porcien, saying that he will send them teachers to open school on July 1st, and so 1682. So all of this expansion is taking place at the same time. So, but that's another reason why I'm inclined to think that the brothers who left and who were replaced, that may have taken place prior to the move to the Rue Neuve, because he's writing that letter, just prior to the time when he's ready to move out of his own home and move in with them into the Rue Neuve. So he's getting more and more involved in the whole operation. Now, if you go to page 78, 79, after he describes the foundation in these three towns, outlying towns, he starts all over again with them leaving. Bland tells this story twice, as he does so many other things. So he says, towards the bottom of 78, while the devil was busy, De La Salle didn't remain idle. And next paragraph, seeing his sheep ready to take their heels and withdraw, made his heart break. The masters had spoken vain, his tears were no good, and ra-di-da-di-da, and so on and so forth. But it goes on and all the way, and here a big long thing about trying to get them to stay. So he gets all mixed up with that. Then on page 80, 81, there's where we have the very, very dramatic confrontation. And I guess in recent years it's Michel Sauvage as much as anybody who has pointed out, and of course Brother Augustine has stressed this in his own talk, that this was the decisive moment. And Sauvage builds it up, especially in a very, very fine talk he gave back in 1984. And I was there present at the time, and that was the year I was in Rome working on the rule. And he made this presentation at the Church of St. Louis of the French in Rome. They were having a series on 17th century spirituality, and he was asked to speak about the spirituality of Jean-Baptiste de La Salle. And he saw this incident, and speaking in French to to the French colony in Paris, that's effectively what it was, the French colony in Rome, Michel made this big distinction of what was happening here in sociological terms. Because De La Salle, and it's his view that up to this point, De La Salle was a nice guy, he was pious, but he was very comfortable. He really, up to this point, didn't have to surrender an awful lot. The move with them into the Rue Neuve may have been giving up something after all, but he still had his foot in the other world. There was still a chance to turn back. But when he finally moves in with them, all of a sudden this is a tremendous shock. And we can get a good bit of that from Bland, what he had to do to himself to be able to eat their food, all those gory stories and so on. And just to begin to live with these people, and his own remarks about how he had considered their social condition. But from here on in, this is the conversion moment, this confrontation with the teachers. And it's very typical. Bland does it very well. The nice, pious thing, the birds of the air, trust providence, and all that sort of stuff, as something like Bland himself does all the time. This was one of those loci communes. De La Salle had a whole stock in trade, especially on providence. And so, talk to these people are worried about the future. Like, as Sauvage says, he could have pulled this thing out of his pocket, and handed them a stock and trade diatribe on the need to trust Providence and so on. And they said, oh, baloney, put your money where your mouth is, or get rid of your money. You have to turn that around. So, and he took it. I'm not so sure it was humorous, but anyway, he certainly, it gave him pause for thought. And so I think that this is the turning point in some ways. And that's another reason why I think 1682 has to be the foundation of the Institute. But now, we have to switch back and forth to follow Blanc because he's got everything out of whack. Suppose you go back to page 76. Now, it was undoubtedly at this point where he's bewildered about what these people are challenging him to. And so, of course, we know that he took a long time. He didn't jump to any conclusions right away. But this really hit him where it hurt. And so he spent a long time praying and agonizing over it. Now, a good bit of his praying was probably in the Basilica of St. Remy, but that'll come up again. But apparently at this point, he went to this garden retreat. So look at page 76 at the bottom. In his perplexity, he decided to make a retreat, to beg God for enlightenment and to discover his holy will. To make this retreat in deeper recollection and silence, he rented a small garden near the Augustinian church next to the city walls, ramparts. It was on the Rue des Murs, which of course would be Wall Street in the plural. This spot was the first witness of his transports of fervor and of his mortification. After having given his orders to his household and left word at the community assisters entrusted to him by Canon Roland, he withdrew into solitude, letting his spirit plunge in undistractedly into mental prayer and practicing mortification without sparing his body. Declares the memoir which you are transcribing here. Obviously not De La Salle's. He would never say this about himself. If the walls of the tiny room, it's another thing, the tiny room of it, which he used as his cell could speak, what would they not tell us of the bloody disciplines and other pious excesses which he yielded to as a result of the spiritual inebriation which the new wine produces in those who begin to drink deep of it? The blood which bespattered this little cell gave testimony to the holy cruelty with which he treated his flesh and to the sacrifices he made for God. There at the start of a truly new life, he drew up a first plan for the most sublime perfection he ever hoped to realize. Well, you have that thing that I passed out the other day about De La Salle at an auction. Now, one of the things in the estate of his father, Louis De La Salle, had rented this garden annually. Now, the father dies in 1672. But, and this was a rented garden, but since the father had title to it for that year, it was included in the analysis or the assessment of all of the father's valuables. And so from that report, we have an exact description of this particular room. First of all, this garden with the house in it, was 23 meters by 27 meters by 19 meters, roughly 30 meters. And that's about 25 yards. Think of a quarter of a football field, huh? So that was the size of this thing. All right, and the location in the report of the assessors is exactly the same as it is in Blanc. That is, adjoining the property of the Augustinians next to the Rue des Murs. So, but the interesting thing is that De La Salle continued to rent this same property annually. He paid the rent for it up until 1683. Okay, so this was part of his own property that he went to for this retreat. The contents are also itemized in the report. And in there was a cabinet, there was 2 tables, there were 8 chairs, huh? You're not going to get 8 chairs into a little cubicle. and there were rakes and hoes and gardening tools of all kinds, etc., etc. And here's what the report says. There's a garden, one of the items is a garden on the Rue des Murs, touching at the rear of the two houses of the congregation of the Augustinians, which are in the Rue of the Augustinians, rented by Father de la Salle pour sa vie naturelle, and sold on his recommendation to a gardener in 1683. So this was, the founder had this for his natural life. Now, what does it mean, natural life? It means for his outdoor life would be a way of putting it. So Rose has a beautiful picture in the cahier where he has produced all this stuff, and he contrasts this with the Blanc thing. That here's where the founder went, put on his overalls, and did some gardening. This is where he got close to nature. Very, very interesting. Yeah? And now, when he's trying to make this decision, he certainly could use it as a retreat for prayer. And if he was into all that scourging, etc., at this point, well, I suppose he gave himself a few wallops. There's nothing against that. But the simple fact of the matter is that this, instead of being the witness to all this bloody stuff and so on and so forth, basically this is where he would often go just to get away from it all, to get some fresh air. Fresh air becomes a big thing with the founder. Keep your eye out for references to fresh air. And he always had a sense of getting close to nature and work with the gardening and so on. So that's another interesting little, just show, you have to be very, very careful of taking Blanc too literally. Okay, so finally, after whatever prayer and penance and everything else he did, the story, you all know the story, and what he came to. Again, if you go to 86, here again, a marvelous, extensive piece out of the founder's own memoir on the origins. And forget all the Blanc stuff and all of this business of the drama, etc. Here's the founder's own language, the arguments back and forth, and the motivation. I think that this is an extremely precious document to be aware of in some detail. Here's where you see John Baptiste de la Salle making up his mind with regard to the Institute and the future. And so he sees the conflict. I've been reduced to silence. As long as I'm not poor, I have no right to talk the language of perfection I used on the subject of poverty. How can I talk about poverty? Then, too, if I remain what I am, see, notice he still has this mental distance from them, even though he's already moved into the Rue Neuve. And the schoolmasters remain what they are. Their temptation will persist because what it produces will subsist. I won't be able to remedy it because they'll always find an obstacle in my will. Sooner or later, such a temptation will not fail to produce the effect the devil hopes it will. The founder is not beyond talking about the devil after the meeting. The desertion will make a good deal of noise. It will frighten off anybody else who wants to become schoolmasters. Notice he's still calling them schoolmasters. Their vocation, without a stable staff of teachers, the schools will fail. He sees that the future of this whole enterprise depends on having a community, a stable community, to make it work. In this case, the heirs of the foundations will claim the funds. Madame de Croyer, for example, and all of the money that she left. Little by little, the institution of Christian and gratuitous schools, he's already using that term, will be buried beneath its ruins, and it'll be useless ever to think of reviving it. He sees clearly what's at stake. Even suppose all this doesn't happen. Can I even act as the superior of these schoolmasters without giving up my canonry? How can I combine my assiduous presence in the house, so as to be at their head during exercises and keep watch over them? With attendance, how can I do that and attend the choir? Are these two positions compatible? If not, I have to give one up. See how logical and how deliberate he is here. True, a canon's prebend is not in itself an obstacle to good work, and so on. And then this famous thing about whether being a canon and saying the office is enough. to keep you occupied. Bland was much preoccupied with that too, because he also was a canon, huh? And he was a little proud of the fact that he did other things at the request of the archbishop. He acted as the supervisor for some religious communities. He was often sent around to do oratory and pull a few of those commonplaces out of his stock and store. But he kind of kept busy. And at one point, they even gave him a parish, which he couldn't stand at all, and got out of that in a hurry. But, so that's the question of, is it possible to be a canon and do other work? Now, what's going to make the balance tip? The greater glory of God, the fuller service of the church, my own higher perfection, and the salvation of souls. Such are the ends I must propose to myself and the aims which govern my choice. There's the motivation. That's the balance. The glory of God. Of course, he incorporates into the vow formula. And as we saw, that was Pierre Fourier's motivation to the sisters, that they could procure the glory of God through the teaching ministry. The fuller service of the church. Fuller service of the church. He's already serving the church as a canon and an advisor to the archbishop. My own higher perfection and the salvation of souls. The relation between his own sanctification and what he could do for others. These are the ends. A powerful sentence. If I consider only these motives, I must resign my canonry and devote myself to the care. And then finally, this number 10, which I guess the superiors kept from us for years and years and years, because they used to get very nervous when anybody ever spoke about a temporary vocation. Whereas here we have clear evidence in the founder's own words that he thought his vocation as a canon was a temporary vocation. Very strong. I no longer feel any attraction to the vocation of a canon. It would seem it has already left me even before I have given up this state of life. I suppose it's dangerous nowadays to underscore this too much, because some of the brothers, we're losing enough of them as it is. But this is his own way of putting it. This calling is no longer for me. While I entered it through the right gate, it seems to me that God is opening another door before me today so that I may leave it. The same voice that called me to it seems to be calling me elsewhere. I hear this in the depths of my conscience. This voice speaks when I consult my conscience. True, since the hand of God put me in the state in which I now am, his hand must take me out of it. But is he not showing me clearly enough today another state that deserves the preference and towards which he is leading me by the hand? So those 10 paragraphs are powerful and precious, I think. Then Bland goes on, to tell the entire truth, De La Salle considered the canon's function as one of the least significant in the church. And he goes on, he said so many times in the memoir he wanted to be fully a priest and exercise it. He felt he was burying his talents. And so on and so forth. And then, in the next paragraph, today the title of canon dispenses many from an active ministry. It can be said such was not always the case. We go back to the beginning, and we must admit that only those lack either the talents or the bishop's consent are to. So he's talking, of course, about his own situation in Rouen as a canon. Right. So, as Bland himself says on the next page, page 89, in the middle paragraph there, at this point I think of De La Salle as resembling a man who has stopped at a spot where various paths emerge. So he's at the crossroads. Now he's contradictory here above, in that paragraph above. He says this longing had remained with him ever since Father Roland had suggested he exchange his canonry for a parish, and it had not been extinguished by the fact that to obey his ordinary he had to give up the idea. But in that three-way deal that we saw earlier, De La Salle himself says that he knew perfectly well that God had never intended him to be a parish priest, so it wasn't that attraction necessarily at all. The decision of a superior convinced him he was not called to be a parish priest, but to remain a canon. Well, down at the bottom. Finally, after much reflection in God's presence, after many prayers, it seemed evident to him towards the end of the year 1682, as he himself writes, now here's some more of the memoir, that God was calling me to take charge of the schools, since he had to be the first at all the exercises, etc. Convinced at last by all the reasons we have enumerated above, he made up his mind to resign his canonry. Even so, he found his spiritual director still unwilling to agree to this change. And so now we go through the whole business of the spiritual director. So Bland then gives us 2 full pages defending the spiritual director, whose advice was wrong, of course. Now there's 2 problems there, of course. How did De La Salle manage finally to convince the spiritual director, number 1? And the other question is, who is this spiritual director? Huh? So that's when things. So we have this big long thing about a typical apologetic of Bland for 2 whole pages and all these paragraphs of defending the spiritual director even when they give the wrong advice. So when the spiritual director is against it, on page 92, he decides to go to Paris to consult the wisest and most enlightened persons in the kingdom. But he still keeps getting to all sorts of different advices. And so everybody's going at him one after the other. But finally, of course, he prevails. Now the question is, who is this spiritual director? I think, as we'll see a little later on when the name finally gets mentioned, it seems to me that probably the spiritual director, through all this period after the death of Roland, his consistent spiritual director through this whole time was Jacques Calou, the priest who was the rector of the major seminary in Reims. Gus, you think so? And so he's consulting all around with all sorts of other people, huh? It's Calou, for example, when it comes to question of whether he should go immediately to Paris or not, or stay in Reims. It's Calou who convinces him that he should stay in Reims, even though Barré wants him to go to Paris, and Barmondier wants him to go to Paris, and so on. But the spiritual director says, no, you should stay in Reims to keep the thing going. All right. Page 95, we get another, in the middle paragraph, the spiritual director is, this apparently is reflecting the spiritual director's advice. Why does he make everyone talk about him so much? Why give the irreligious an occasion to make fun of religion, etc., etc.? What a blot on his reputation if he's unhappy with the decision. If he remains firm in his resolve, which he may well do since he is so hard-headed, what a spectacle will he not offer to the world when he, a canon, becomes a schoolmaster, when he places himself at the head of a band of beggars and becomes a beggar like them. So there's the old hard-headed De La Salle again. Then we get page 102, the decision is heroic, the whole business of resigning his canonry in favor of this Flaubert, the marvelous thing about what finally happens to Flaubert, huh? Takes 8 men to carry out his body when he dies, and he just gets fatter and fatter and fatter all the time. It's on page 110 that we get Calou identified, and so on. Then at the very end of this first volume, the whole question of what to do with the money now that he's given it away. And then, of course, the famine comes along and the distribution. Notice how carefully the distribution is done and how he gets the ecclesia, all of those paintings of the founder at the door and the brothers giving out the bread right, left, etc., and the beggars, etc. Well, it was much more organized than that. Huh? He divides them into 3 groups, and these others help them, and of course apparently a good bit of that was to make sure that the routine of the schools kept going and that the kids themselves would be the first ones to take advantage of it. And the amount of money, Bland says 40,000 livres was what he gave away. Battersby extrapolates that into several $1 million, but it's probably a little kind of exaggerated. When he gives away finally all of his patrimony, he keeps, as Brother Augustine has pointed out and emphasized, he keeps enough money in trust to be able to receive a stipend of 200 livres a year for his books and for his travels and for other necessities. That's the advice of his director. the whole business of whether or not the school should be endowed, and Barre's advice, endow them only on providence, and that was a decision he makes. So the money doesn't go to the schools at this point, although he's not beyond using some of his personal resources as time goes on over the course of his life. And needless to say, after this gesture of divesting himself of anything to fall back on, the founder still has, he continues to acquire property, he continues to receive grants and so on. When his grandmother dies in 1691, she leaves her extensive, the whole Brouilly estate, she leaves to be divided among her 3 sons and her only daughter's heirs, which would include De La Salle and all of his living brothers and sisters. So the La Salle family got 1/4 of Perret L'Espagnol's property, very extensive property and wealth out there. And so he had, it's like the rich man in the gospel. If he left everything, gave everything away to follow Christ and come follow me, he would have had to start all over again with the rest of them. The apostles they had a purse, which Judas kept. So it's impossible to actually give away everything, literally. But it certainly was a dramatic and a heroic gesture. That finishes this first volume. Is there anything that you would like to raise or that struck you that I passed over too quickly? As I said, I highlighted a few things. Maybe you would like to highlight a few things. Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to get a handle on what the founder might have meant at that time by the institution of Christian schools, as mentioned in the memoir of this decision that he made, given Canterbury. How many schools were in existence at that time? Was he looking beyond Reims already, or that the Champion area? Was he thinking of something of a real national system?
No, not necessarily, I don't think. I think it's a little premature for that. But at this moment, there are 3 schools and maybe 4 in Reims. And there are 3 schools, there are 3, maybe 4 outside of Reims. So it's a network of 6 schools. And I think when he uses that term, he's using the same term that Barre used in Rouen for a similar local network of schools. Now, his vision expands beyond that as he gets more and more involved, and especially when he sees the implications of Letellier's offer, and there's pressure for him to go to Paris from Barre, who's trying to, all the time, right from very early on, convince him that if this thing is ever going to amount to anything, it ought to be located in Paris instead of way up in the provincial capital of Reims. But when he uses this expression in this context, I think he feels that this network of the 6 or 7 schools is already sufficiently worthwhile and doing enough good. That would be my response to that. Does it make any sense to you? Fergus?
Just wonder how he defined the will of God in his regard. Like in this case here, he didn't get the answer he wanted from his spiritual director, so he shopped around.
He shops around.
He gets the one he wants.
Yeah. He gets it in his conscience first, I think. He gets some sense, that God's telling him something, but he always wants it sanctioned by somebody else. But if he has his mind made up on something, it seems to me, he's not all that totally docile and obedient to the spiritual director. Or if he first of all tries to persuade the director, I can imagine having him as well, I don't do spiritual direction, but some of you do. Imagine having De La Salle as one of your clients. And there must be a hell of a lot of dialogue goes on with a man like that, who sees pretty much, or who may be well ahead of the director in trying to discern what God's calling him to do. But that's an area outside of my own experience, so I'd better not say too much about it. I've probably said too much already.
And second, just would he have paid the schoolmasters? There's no mention there of any schoolmasters living in the house of them being paid.
Oh, yeah, sure there is, because, right, remember Madame de la Croix, or de Croix, whatever her name was? She endowed all of those things, but every one of those was somehow endowed. Huh?
Yeah, but when they're giving out about him and asking to give up his money, they never mention wages in it. They just think that they're totally nothing.
Well, as we saw when we tried to analyze how far 150 livres would go, this was mere subsistence pay. And their attitude is if the schools fall apart, will be left out on the street. As he himself says in his own reflections, if the school's closed, there'll never be any way of getting them back again, and the money from the foundations will go back to the original people who endowed the school. So that source of revenue would have dried up for them. But they were getting barely enough just to be able to live on and to subsist.
I wonder, was it just came to a real board? Whether he actually-
Well, the money, I presume that he had some control over the money, but there was just barely enough to support them. I don't think he gave them a salary. Oh, if that's what you mean, no, I don't think so.
It seems that in the material that we've covered so far, a shift is taking place from the focus being on the schools to the focus being on the stability of the community that's being organized.
That's interesting thought, yeah. But I think the two are so closely intertwined all along, because as we saw from those earlier things in the century, those earlier attempts to reform a school here, there, it was spotty, and there was no stable community organized to make sure that these things would continue. And that's why I use the word network a little bit, because it was the network that kept kept the schools being supported all the time. Does that make any sense? So it's precisely the community that makes that assures the survival of the school. But we must also remember that Bland is writing a biography of the person of the founder too, and so he's not going to be too involved in the whole business of how the schools were run, and the methodology, and all that. That comes in the conduit, of course, and that's the whole. You'll get to that in Buttimer 2 next year.
It seems that in the beginning, Lasalle seemed to figure out what was a good technique for running the school, but then he couldn't keep the people who he had trained. And then the focus to accomplish the task of education, he really had to focus in on getting people to stay after the training that he did.
Yeah, but the training doesn't change, does it? I'm not sure that I understand what the problem is.
Well, I mean, I don't see a problem, but I see a switch as far as emphasis.
Oh, yeah.
That his direction was more towards their spiritual development and stability.
Yeah, but what I see as the consistency, though, is from the minute he first got involved with them, he wanted to get them into a pattern of living a regular, stable type of lifestyle, and that stable lifestyle would have all the elements that they would pray together, that he would give them a spiritual vision and a deep personal spirituality. They'd start with that. But then they would have discipline in the school. Having learned to discipline themselves, there would be discipline in the school. And they would always teach by association together. That comes up all the way through this thing. You would never send one out. That's a very important part of the policy decision. And then going on from that this then became a regular way in which they conducted their schools. And then there was evidence that, for example, the management of schools, the conduit, was put together probably out of these discussions they'd have at the end of the day, and there's reference to that, about how things went in the school. So little by little, just as Gabe Healy was saying the other night, it became a kind of a collective wisdom about what you do when you get into the school. It takes him a long while before he gives them anything like a formal novitiate. I guess maybe that's what he was saying. Peter.
Just, I guess, in response to that, it would make sense if it seems that the founder would shift the emphasis to the formation or development of the school teachers, because he saw that as necessary to the survival of the
Yeah.
Even yesterday, he was talking about the way Lasalle shifted the others around.
Mm.
It seems to be emphasis on the school, but on the needs of the individual as well.
Yeah, but
My understanding is that everything was so standardized that if you shift somebody from here to here, they would do the
Wouldn't
same thing no matter where
exactly.
they are.
Exactly. Great deal of uniformity in the method. Gus, you wanted to make a comment?
Well, I just think it points up the centrality of the vow of association, which was the original vow.
Yeah, right.
That he built the whole idea of an association, but it wasn't just for the sake of associating, it was for the school.
Yeah. Don?
I find it interesting that all of a sudden he switches to the memoir to quote verbatim the standpoint, from the conversion. Do we have any assurance that he didn't embellish these?
No, except I suppose internal evidence. And it strikes me as so different and so, so conformity, so consistent with everything we know about the founder.
Do we actually have?
But we don't have the text, that's the problem. So the text has to be reconstructed. And of course, the other thing is that in the French text itself, it's set off in quotation marks and a different type. Gus?
Critics Paul points out that when Blaine quotes letters, of which we have the original, Blaine is faithful to what he does not acknowledge. We don't have a lot of evidence, but what evidence do you have is that Blaine is faithful to his source.
Brian? Did you have your hand up? No. George?
We'll comment on that term process. I guess it's the foundation of the institute.
Yeah.
As a process. Well, here's being a biologist, here's a couple analogies, or one analogy in my mind. You could talk a new human being. You could emphasize the day you are born. But there's a process of formation that's going on before the actual event, which we call the birth. And, so we like to say these are different things happening, but I like to take the event is when they first made a vow, which I think is 84 or something like that. It's not mentioned there yet. But maybe all these things leading up to this group of men make a promise to live together. Then that's the event that starts the institution. Or another one that comes to my mind is just our novitiate. The novitiate is a process of religious formation. It culminates in the event of making vows at the end. So I would like to maybe, with regard to when did our institute start? Well, the event was the vow. And before that were some process going on leading up to that event.
Yeah. Two comments. First of all, I agree with you. The analogy is fit and apt. I wouldn't take the vows, though. I would take the movement to the Rue Neuve, where they formed a community, because that was their commitment to association. But there are some problems with the vows. An analogy I would use in that regard, from theology and history, is the process by which the church was founded. When Jesus Christ went to heaven, they were still all Jews. There was no Catholic Church at that time. Not at all. It certainly did. And it took a long time for the church to emerge, and an even longer time for the papacy to emerge, as I hinted at the other day. That there were no bishops. By the time we get to the end of the New Testament, we still don't have any local bishop any place. We still do not have a Eucharistic sacrifice. A lot of things we don't have. We don't have any practice of the sacrament of penance. At the end of the New Testament, it takes time for these things to develop. At what moment do you want to say we've got the Catholic Church? Maybe we haven't got it yet. A lot of hands. Michael?
Kind of this whole thing is a point of reflection that this whole decision-making process of the founder to get up this academy and to get schoolmasters and so forth. I see a lot of analogies in the present day that maybe look at the next few years, maybe the next general chapter, as maybe this is what we're being called to do today, is to take another significant step, and that is to move through this whole concept of association, what it means for today. Perhaps giving up some of the things we're so used to. It's what be analogous to the founder giving up his canonry, and maybe what we're going to plunge into is just as offensive to some of the brothers as it was to the founder to plunge into the community life of the schoolmasters. That's what strikes me in all of this.
See, in one sense, the foundation and the founders and the pioneers, in a certain sense, always have an easier time of it, at least, because most of the time they're starting something new, and it's the sociologists have analyzed this about the charismatic leader and the first disciples. So they're filled with enthusiasm, filled with freshness, they're breaking ground, they're breaking into something new, and the results are apparent immediately. De La Salle, and even in 1682, they could begin to see before their very eyes how, the famous expression, the need of this institute is very great. They saw the need, they saw they were fulfilling it, they saw the difference that they made. When you're involved in an institution that is 300 years old and more or less with its own ways set and embedded and so on, it's not so easy to see that you're all that needed when everybody else is doing the same thing and some people doing it even better. And so I think that's what's confronting the Institute. As we begin now to talk more and more, what is it the characteristic of our schools in today's world? Or what are we being called to do that maybe has nothing to do with the schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly, I agree with you completely. Okay?
That's what I was going to ask, and that's a good question for me, because I was wondering, it seems to be easy to identify what the identity of this group was at the time of LaSalle. If you try to grapple with that problem today, the word identity is so amorphous and we're caught up in the culture and a million things. So I think that's a very valid point.
I think it's emerging. That was the point I tried to make last year at the convocation. That it is an institute in a process of transition. And I like the reflection in the founder's meditation for the Feast of St. Barnabas, which occurs in the middle of June, that he said they set off, St. Barnabas set off, going out into like a man going out into the open sea without a sail and without oars. And I think perhaps maybe that's where we are. But the founder, that is a part of his own experience. He didn't really know what was going to come. Frank?
I'm just amazed at the amount of time that the founder spent, not in pure spirituality, but in introspection. As I look at these 10 points here, it's almost a model of logic, where this man sits by himself and point by point, without even going into the spiritual or religious, logically he lines up his arguments and so on. And I am supposed to imitate him, but introspection such as he displays here, can be a very dangerous activity. You have to maintain balance and so on, you see, and this man can do that. Today, with all the guidelines and so on for introspection and so on, it becomes a very painful process and can be quite harmful to mental health. But that's what I find these 10 points.
How do you know?
How do I know
I'm sorry. That it can be harmful to mental health, But no, I agree. But would you say that that's all introspection? I mean, there are external reference, There is the good to be done by the schools. And what will happen if he doesn't see it? There's the objectivity of the vocation of the canon, and his reference point always is, what does God want? So I think it is true. It's logical, and he's thinking it through. But I think he's not just thinking it through out of his own insides. If you looked at those things closely, you'll see all those other elements there. Jack?
Something about what Michael said and what Gabe was saying. When you were going through those things, 86 through 88, the 10 points that Lasallian says significant in his decision-making process. It reminds me of what some of what I hear from a lot of young men today. Like, why be a brother? I can do this, and I want to be a doctor or I want to be a teacher. And a lot of question of identity, of our place, and the question that you raised, like the need of this institute is very great, and it's not as dramatically seen, perhaps by younger people today. I'm curious, like in what we've read about so far, we got De La Salle being invited by Roland and Neil and all these other guys, and his eyes being opened and seeing this. What do we know about the first schoolmaster? And what was involved in, how did they get involved? How did perhaps Neil, what did he say to them? How did they come off the streets to come into this? Is it just social, like a moving up in the society, something over your head? But then when we read about the habit, they're getting all this abuse and
Well, I think that, you know, the answer to that is in the text, though. Their attraction to the work is part of it. Their attraction to the founder is certainly part of it. Their attraction to this particular type of lifestyle, which was different and a kind of an adventure. Some of the early ones, I think Yale just picked them up because they were wandering around jobless and so on. Well, here was something that at least they get enough to eat and so on. And those are the ones that left. But then new recruits came because again, I think the results were tangible. And it looked like an interesting thing that they could do without too many requirements. They didn't have to know anything really or have any special qualities. But then little by little, as we'll see as we begin to get into this second volume, is that people of fairly good means began to be attracted to it. And I think, as some of you have already raised, that raises the question of something like the Moonies. Why do perfectly normal kids get attracted to some of those sects of that kind? And so it's the same thing. It's hard to analyze. I'm not sure I have. Bill?
I just want to mention that it says that St. LaSalle never turned anybody away who applied to be a brother. And yet we have all this screening process and so on. I was wondering how we changed over the years.
Oh, well, that only started when we began to get psychologists in the outfit. I remember one time when there were 3 candidates for the Visitor of New York, and Brother Augustine was one, and I was the other, and I think Johnny Martin was the third. And that was the time, it was back in the 60s, when the psychologists were really going strong and heavy in those days. And somebody asked me in the question period what I thought about the psychologists. I said, I think we should do away with them, because if we have all of this screening of candidates, what are we going to do for superiors if we drum out all the crazies? Needless to say, I was not elected the Visitor. And Gus was. All right, let's go to the second volume. We have, 64 pages in this to finish up yesterday's assignment. Andrew, do you have a question?
Yes, St. LaSalle set out his brothers by twos,
Yeah.
with these places around Reims. Would they have any relationship with the founder except by mail during that time, or would they come back to Reims occasionally?
Well, that's not completely clear. The distances weren't that great, though. Well, they could make the trip back and forth overnight, but if they had to run their own school, there were always 2 of them together. And the schools up in the north, those little towns are not that far apart. And remember, in the beginning, it was Niel who was involved with at the beginning, Niel had the ones outside Reims, and the founder kept the 3 schools in Reims itself, of course, they all lived in the Rue Neuve. They all lived in the same house. So it was only gradually that outside group got involved with the Reims group, because they were more or less in Niel's hands. And I presume that he had kept some supervisory role. And as you see, or we haven't seen it yet, but he will be increasingly ask De La Salle to take the responsibility for those people. And so you can be sure that De La Salle himself probably visited them. Well, we see some instances again. Okay. But then little by little, but the idea of bringing them all together regularly doesn't come until we get to Paris. Okay.
The Matthew book doesn't bring that out too well. He just mentions Niel much later on.
Yeah. Well, that's why I prefer the Blanc thing, because it's considerably more detailed. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can get through some of this section in the next. Well, there are a lot of interesting little details here, and we can go over some of them rather quickly, I think. This would probably come under the rubric of life at the Rue Neuve. And I think most of you have read this all, and there's not an awful lot to say about it. I think on page 2, where he talks about the fact that not everybody is aware of, that when he moved into the Rue Neuve, it was large enough house. Now, this business of little cubicle where the founder is, forget all of that, huh? That may have been the case, and the cubicle isn't that small. When later on, towards the end of his life, when he's in Grenoble, he's living in a very small little room at the top of the house and only shows up for exercise. But Blank keeps putting that every place he is, he's got a little cubicle of a room. Now, most of these houses were large, rambling things, so I'm inclined to think that he's just putting that in every once in a while as, again, one of his standard buttons that he pushes. But anyway, he says on page 2 here that these ecclesiastics were in the house, and this, of course, was probably a source of revenue for the house, too, to help support. And one of them was Faubert and so on. And Faubert also had some seminarians that he was training in the house at the same time. And so De La Salle realized that the two ought to split. So he gives Faubert the bigger of the two sections of the house. But then finally he has to go and get the bigger one. And that's, if you got that map of Reims, that's right at that triangular corner there where the brothers eventually got the whole thing. We have the business of what the founder had to do in order to be able to eat the food, including swallowing his vomit over and over again, and it was not very appetizing. On page 6, the story of the absinthe. That's a good story. It's a good example, of showing how detached the founder. Here's the not interested in food, typical Saint-Sulpice stuff. Remember old Tronson telling them to eat their meals in a sense of. So we get the absinthe, and absinthe makes the food grow fonder or something. But we'll get the absinthe story again when they're at Vaugirard. So don't be surprised when we come to Vaugirard if we get the absinthe story again. Now, it obviously didn't happen twice. And they're poisoned the ball. That's been happening in the Institute ever since, too. Page 8, that's where we get the vigils in the Basilica of Saint-Remy. It's worth dwelling on that just for a moment or two. Have you got that map of Reims with you still that I gave out yesterday? Take a look at where that is. Now, locate the Rue Neuve again where the first community is there, right in that triangular thing with the little slit between the two houses. And then go all the way over to the right to the edge of the thing, and there's where the Basilica of Saint Remy is. And look at notice the size of it, by the way, compared, for example, to the size of the cathedral. It's not quite as long as the cathedral is, but it's considerably wider, actually, in scale. And it really is a huge, big basilica, a very barren basilica, but it's got 3 portals in the front of it, so it's an enormous place. And that's where St. Remy, who converted, supposedly baptized Clovis, his tomb is there, a great big enormous thing and so on. And that apparently is where the founder, on at least one occasion, had the sacristan lock him up for the weekend. Of course, Bland has him doing it, spending all of his weekends locked up in the basilica, which may, again, be something of an exaggeration. But if you got a good story, why not tell it over 4 or 5 times every chance you get? So have some idea. And you see the distances there, again, with that scale. So, then Blanc, just to show you how he's in Rouen, writing in Rouen, where the founder died, where he's a canon and so on and so forth. So he tends things from his own experience in Rouen, he tends to put back. Look on page 8 in the 3rd paragraph there. This great attraction for complete solitude and unceasing contemplation brought him sometime later to the retreat house of the Discalced Carmelite Fathers at Louviers, a few miles from Rouen. Well, why put that in here, where he's still in Reims, and all that sort of stuff, but he can't resist the temptation when he thinks of something just to throw it in there. Whether it fits or not, he's not the least bit interested in sequence part. This priest, the parish priest of the St. Peter's in Laon, this Pierre Guillard is his name. We'll see him later, considerably later, when the trouble with the cardinal begins to develop. The brothers there, he was very close to the brothers in Laon, and he interfered a little bit, or at least he tried to find out what was going on that occasion. We'll see that later. Page 11, there's a big emphasis here on consultation again. But now here again, De La Salle calls together his principal disciples. Now in this whole story, De La Salle has this meeting. I suppose this would be, in a certain sense, the 1686, right? And this is sometimes known as the First General Assembly. Now, Blas says, I forget which one is which. my affair says 1684 and Bland says 86, or is it the other way around? Huh? 84. And my affair says 86, and most of us now think it's 86. 84 is a little too soon. 84 is probably when the habit was adopted, and I gave you that sheet yesterday, which I presume you have read. Huh? So the habit came first, and then the name, and then probably this assembly. Now it says he picked the first 12 the 12 principal brothers. Well, again, I think that he's thinking here, and then 4 of the 12 left the next year or something. Well, I think again he's confusing here this and 1694. If he had a general assembly, it was probably all of the brothers. There's no reason why any of them would have been excluded. There's nothing to distinguish one from the other, and there aren't that many houses. In 1694, at Vaugirard in Paris, after the heroic vow, and when the Institute is getting pretty well settled, this is tomorrow's work, then he brings 12 brothers, and they're the ones who make the first final vow. And it's the same thing with the discussion here about vows. Bland talks about that whole vow discussion almost as if it were the same discussion that took place in 1694, and it's premature to think about it that way. Huh? So I think Bland is, again, he's jumping the gun a little bit too much in his description of this important assembly. It's interesting that in the history of the Institute, the choice of whether you're going to take 1684 or whether you're going to take 1686 is sometimes influenced by what's going on in the present-day general chapters. In the general chapter of 1934, after the chapter was over, the Superior General and a large number of the capitulants went to Reims and made a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady of Liesse, where the founder went at the end of this assembly after the brothers first pronounced vows, on an overnight pilgrimage from Reims. And so the Superior General and a lot of the capitulants went from Reims to Liesse, to the shrine of Our Lady of Liesse, and there's a stained glass window now in that shrine showing there the brothers, the general chapter of 1934, going there because it was the 250th anniversary of the first assembly. Huh? Whereas when we had the general chapter in 1986, we had it in 1986, and thereby the official date was 1686 because that was the 300th anniversary of the thing. Huh? So that's an example where the previous choice of the date did not prevail. But it's interesting that in the history in the literature of the Institute, this is always referred to as the first General Assembly, but it is not considered a general chapter. The first general chapter in the counting, the most recent one was the 41st, but the first general chapter in the counting is the general chapter of 1617, just as the first superior general is Brother Bartholomew and not the founder. 1717, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, so that's the story of this. Now on page 14, good old Blanc, he's thinking like a canonist and an ecclesiastic. And this whole question of vows. And he's going on this big long song and dance about chastity and poverty and all that sort of stuff. Again, I suspect most of that discussion, probably if it took place at all, took place in 1694 and not on the occasion of this first assembly. The question, obviously, all they could do would be to make a private vow. And again, it wasn't exactly, the first one wasn't so much association, it was the first vow. They decided, well, one thing from the tradition that would help hold them together. See, there again, the problem of stability would be a vow of obedience. So, and the founder, this was one of the questions he proposed to them. Should we solidify this enterprise by asking you to commit yourself to it before the Lord, and to take upon yourself before the Lord some kind of a permanent commitment, or some kind of a commitment that would be see, this is why, George, the vow thing, they're already, in a sense, as the founder says, committed, all right? And if you read that thing that Maurice Hermans wrote, by his interpretation when he writes the memoir on the habit, is that by putting on the habit, you are already committed and consecrated, you see? So the consecration or the commitment is a distinct thing from making the vows. And I think that's one of the things we begin to see more and more. because the founder's concept of being committed to this work is putting on the habit and joining the community and forming the community. Whereas then it's a question of, well, are you going to express this by vows? And is everybody going to take the vows? Or are just some people going to take the vows? And that was the situation in the Institute all the way up until 1917. And then what vows? Here, the first time, they make a vow of obedience. The heroic vow is a vow to found the Institute, to associate to found the Institute. The 1694 vows are vows of stability, obedience, and association to keep gratuitous schools. See? And now we take, I took originally final vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, teaching the poor gratuitously, and stability. So brothers have been taking all sorts of different vows over the years. The vows are an expression of this commitment. So at this stage of the game, the thing that's most in focus is obedience. The other question that's open here is, for how long was it? And it seems to be contradictory as you read it, that it was a vow for 1 year, but then they're talking about a vow for 3 years. And what it seems to be is that they took the vow for 3 years, renewable annually. And that was the practice of temporary vows in the Institute all the way up through the 19th century. That was the case, for example, with Brother Mushin Marie. His first temporary vows were triennial, but then they had to apply to renew them. Then they would renew them each year, so that kept pushing the date further back, and he was refused the first time around.
Just to back up you with an interesting observation. In our institute, when you talk about the big date is like when you became a brother. Yeah. You put down when you receive the habit of being an officiate. But many other religious orders, it's when you make the first vow, they put down the starting date. And so this is
that's a good observation. It is true too.
I have two sisters that are nuns, so they're end of the novitiate is the date they put down, because they're going to jubilee and all this kind of stuff. You know, it happens from the end of the novitiate. Ours is from the beginning of the novitiate, when you receive the habit. So,
yeah, that's canonical thinking again, that vow thing. Whereas I think our tradition really is, right, your brother from the start. Okay, see you at 11.